Welcome to Johnny Carson Files. On this video, Mr. Rogers is mid-sentence answering one of Johnny Carson's questions with his usual quiet warmth when his eyes drift past the camera and land on a small girl in a wheelchair sitting in the third row. He stops talking completely. The audience does not understand yet, but that little girl is the reason Fred Rogers almost did not come on this show tonight at all. But before we dive in, quick reminder, double-check that you're subscribed, since a lot of you think you already are and aren't. It's free, and it really helps the channel. Thank you for being here. The Tonight Show was recorded that afternoon in early 1982 before a studio audience of roughly 300 people at NBC's Burbank studios. The broadcast set to air to nearly 18 million Americans later that night. Mr. Rogers had come on to talk about his program, about puppets, about the ordinary magic of talking honestly to children, and for the first 10 minutes, it was exactly the gentle, unhurried conversation everyone expected from him. Johnny Carson, who genuinely admired Fred Rogers, leaned in with real curiosity rather than his usual practiced charm. "Fred," Johnny said, "how do you explain hard things to kids, things even adults don't know how to talk about?" Fred Rogers folded his hands in his lap the way he always did before answering something that mattered to him. "You tell them the truth, gently," he said. "Children can survive almost anything, as long as they're not lied to and as long as they know someone is with them. That's the whole secret, really. Not shielding them from the world, but making sure they never have to face it feeling alone." Johnny nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant he was genuinely thinking about the answer, rather than simply moving to his next question. "That's a beautiful way to put it," Johnny said. "Do you ever worry that the world's too hard for that approach? That some things are too big to explain gently?" Fred Rogers considered this for a long moment, the studio quiet in the particular way it always got when he spoke, an unusual hush that had nothing to do with production cues and everything to do with the way people naturally leaned in around him. "Everything is too big at first," Fred said. "That's what it feels like to be small. And to be honest, Johnny, that's what it feels like sometimes to be an adult, too. But the size of the thing was never really the point. The point was always whether or not you had to face it by yourself." Wait, do not miss this detail, because as Fred Rogers said those words, his gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the audience, and what he saw there stopped him completely. In the third row sat a girl of about 8 years old, thin, pale, a soft knit cap covering a bare scalp, seated in a wheelchair beside a woman who was gripping her hand tightly. Fred Rogers's sentence trailed off mid-thought, the words simply evaporating somewhere between his mind and his mouth. The studio, which had been comfortably quiet a moment before, grew tense with a different kind of quiet, the kind built from confusion rather than attention. Johnny Carson glanced toward the audience, then back at Fred, unsure what had happened, his easy hosting instincts momentarily unable to locate the source of the shift. "Fred," Johnny said carefully, "you all right?" Fred Rogers did not answer right away. He was still looking at the girl, and something in his expression had moved from warmth into something closer to recognition, though nobody watching yet understood why a stranger in the audience would cause a reaction like that from a man who met thousands of strangers every year without ever losing his composure. What you have seen so far is nothing compared to what happened next, because the story that was about to unfold reached back 3 weeks to a children's hospital in Pittsburgh, and a promise Fred Rogers had made that he had never told a single person on his own staff, not his producers, not his closest friends, nobody. 3 weeks earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that nobody at the studio had marked as anything unusual, Fred Rogers had visited Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, as he often did quietly, without cameras, without press releases, simply because he believed it mattered more than any taping schedule ever could. These visits were not publicized. His staff scheduled them the same way they scheduled a dentist appointment, a private matter of Fred's own conscience rather than anything meant for public relations. He walked the wards slowly that day, stopping wherever a nurse mentioned a child who might want company, sitting on the edges of beds, asking questions and, more importantly, listening to the answers the way almost nobody else in a child's life had the patience to do. On that visit, a nurse named Carol Whitfield introduced him to a girl named Emily Hastings, who had been fighting a rare and aggressive form of leukemia for just over a year. Emily was 8 years old, sharp-eyed and quiet in the particular way that very sick children sometimes become, having learned early that most adults around her were more comfortable when she performed calm rather than admitted fear. Emily did not ask Fred Rogers for an autograph. She did not ask him to sing a song, though she knew every one by heart, having watched his program every single afternoon for as long as she could remember, back when watching television simply meant being a child and not yet meaning being a patient. Instead, she asked him a question that stopped him cold in the doorway of her hospital room, one hand still resting on the frame. "Mr. Rogers," she said, her voice small but steady, "if I don't get better, will you tell everyone on your show that it's okay to be scared?" Fred Rogers did not answer immediately. He walked into the room, pulled the single visitor's chair closer to the bed, and then, instead of sitting in it, he sat down on the edge of the bed itself, something the hospital staff would later say he never did with anyone else, a small breach of his own careful habits that nobody who witnessed it ever forgot. He stayed for almost 40 minutes. Nurse Whitfield, checking in twice during that time, said she found them simply talking, Fred asking Emily about her stuffed rabbit, about which of his puppets she liked best, about what she missed most from before the hospital, and Emily answering everything with the same startling directness she had used to ask her original question. Before Fred Rogers left, Emily made him promise something specific, something so unusual that Nurse Whitfield remembered the exact wording of it clearly years later, when a reporter finally tracked down the full story. She asked him not to say her name on television, not to make it into a story about her specifically, but simply to promise that somewhere, sometime soon, he would look right into the camera and tell every scared kid watching that being afraid did not mean being alone. Fred Rogers took her hand in both of his and promised her he would. He did not know when. He did not know how. He simply knew, the way he seemed to know most important things, that he would find the moment when it was time. What he did not know, what nobody arranging his upcoming Tonight Show appearance knew, because there was no way for anyone to have known, was that Emily's family had been given tickets to that particular night's taping through a hospital outreach program entirely unrelated to Fred's private visit, a coincidence so improbable that when Fred Rogers finally realized who he was looking at in the third row of that studio audience, his entire composure, famous among colleagues for never cracking under any circumstance, simply gave way all at once. Back in the Burbank studio, Fred Rogers turned to Johnny Carson, his eyes visibly wet, his hands, usually so still and folded, now trembling slightly against his knees. "Johnny," he said quietly, "would you mind if I said hello to someone in your audience?" Johnny Carson, a man who had built an entire career on reading a room in half a second, sensed immediately that this was not a bit, not a planned segment, not anything resembling the usual rhythm of the show. He nodded immediately, waving a hand toward the audience without hesitation. "Of course, Fred. Whatever you need." Fred Rogers stood up from the guest chair, something guests almost never did uninvited on that stage, and walked toward the edge of it, down the few steps into the audience aisle, while 300 people watched in a silence that had by now turned fully solemn. sensing that whatever was happening mattered more than anything scripted for that evening. He knelt down in front of the wheelchair, his knees settling onto the carpeted aisle floor without any apparent thought for his suit, and took both of Emily's small hands in his own. "Emily," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough for the studio microphones mounted along the aisle to catch every word. "I made you a promise 3 weeks ago, and I did not know I would get to keep it this soon." The audience gasped as one sound, rippling backward through all 300 seats like a single wave finding shore. Ed McMahon rose halfway out of his chair, his usual booming presence reduced to stunned silence. Johnny Carson sat frozen at his desk for a moment before he too rose, hand pressed briefly over his mouth. Emily's mother, a woman named Diane Hastings, began to cry, silently at first, both hands covering her face as her shoulders shook, the sound eventually escaping in small broken breaths that the nearby microphones caught along with everything else. Emily looked up at Fred Rogers with wide, startled eyes, the kind of look that suggested she had never actually expected the promise to be kept. Not really. Not the way an 8-year-old learns not to fully expect promises from anyone once illness has taught her how quickly the world can change its mind. "You remembered me," she whispered. Fred Rogers's voice cracked completely on his next words. "I have thought about you every single day since I left that hospital room," he said. "Every day, Emily, and I am going to keep my promise right now, in front of everyone, because you asked me to, and because it is the most important thing anyone has asked me to do in a very long time." He turned, still kneeling, his knees surely aching against the aisle carpet, though he gave no sign of noticing, and looked directly into the nearest camera. And for a moment it seemed as though he was speaking only to Emily, and also somehow to every frightened child watching from a hospital bed or a dark bedroom anywhere in the country that night. "If you are scared right now," Fred Rogers said, his voice steady despite the tears visible on his face, "that does not mean you are doing anything wrong. Being scared means you understand that something matters. And I want you to know, wherever you are watching from, that you are not carrying that fear by yourself. Someone is with you. I am with you." He turned back to Emily and gently squeezed her hands between his own. "And I am especially with you," he said, "because you are the reason I got to say that tonight, instead of just thinking about saying it. You gave me the moment, Emily. Thank you for that." The studio held its breath. Nobody applauded right away, because what had happened was too large, too tender for the usual sounds a television audience makes in response to anything. Johnny Carson stepped around his desk and walked down into the audience himself, something he had done perhaps twice before in his entire career on that stage, and knelt beside Fred Rogers, his own eyes wet, his usually unshakable composure entirely set aside. "Fred," Johnny said quietly, "thank you for showing all of us what that actually looks like." Emily, still holding Fred Rogers's hands, managed a small, genuine smile, the first her mother would later say she had seen in nearly 2 weeks. Diane Hastings, still crying, reached out and rested a hand on Fred Rogers's shoulder, unable to form words yet, simply needing to touch the moment somehow. It was Ed McMahon, finally finding his voice, who broke the silence gently from the stage, saying only, "Folks, I don't think any of us are going to forget this one," before falling quiet again himself. What almost nobody in that studio knew, and what would only come out in interviews years later, was how close Fred Rogers had come to not appearing on the show at all that week. His schedule had been unusually demanding, a string of tapings and appearances that had left him exhausted in a way his staff rarely saw, and he had seriously considered postponing the Tonight Show appearance to the following month. It was only a small, almost offhand comment from his wife Joanne the night before, asking simply whether something was pulling at him, that made Fred Rogers pause and reconsider. He later said he could not explain the feeling precisely, only that something told him the timing mattered, though he had no way of knowing why until he was sitting in that guest chair looking out into the third row. If a story like this moves you even a little, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them. And I want to ask you something specific. Think of a moment when a stranger's kindness reached you at exactly the right time, when you needed it and had no way of knowing it was coming. And drop just one word for what that kindness was in the comments below, so we can see how many of us have carried something like that with us. The Tonight Show ran 9 minutes over its scheduled time that evening, and NBC's switchboard stayed lit well past midnight, with calls from parents of sick children, from hospital staff who recognized exactly what they were watching, from people who had simply needed to hear on an ordinary Tuesday night that they were not alone in whatever they happened to be carrying that week. Letters arrived at NBC for months afterward, many of them addressed simply to Mr. Rogers, Tonight Show, as though the writers assumed that would be enough to reach him, that the postal system itself understood how important the destination was. Fred Rogers answered every single one personally, a habit his staff said he maintained his entire life regardless of how many arrived, often staying at his office desk long after everyone else had gone home, working through a stack of envelopes by hand, because he believed a form response would betray the very thing he had spent his career trying to model for an entire generation of children. Producers at other networks, watching the broadcast the following morning on tape, reportedly debated for weeks afterward whether the moment could ever have been intentionally engineered, whether some version of it could be recreated for ratings on another program with another guest. Fred Rogers, when a journalist eventually asked him directly whether he had known Emily would be in that audience, simply shook his head and said that the entire value of what happened was that nobody, including himself, had planned a single second of it. The moment worked, he said, precisely because it could not have been produced. You cannot manufacture a promise. You can only decide, ahead of time, to be the kind of person who keeps one when the moment finally arrives, whenever and however it happens to arrive. That was as close as Fred Rogers ever came to explaining, in his own words, why that particular broadcast meant more to him than any of the thousands of hours of television he made across 4 decades on the air. Emily Hastings passed away 4 months later, in the late spring of 1982, at home, surrounded by her family, in the bedroom she had grown up in rather than in a hospital room, which her mother said had been the one thing Emily asked for most in her final weeks, and the one promise the family had been determined, above all others, to keep. Diane Hastings later wrote a letter to Fred Rogers that his staff kept for years afterward, in a small file separate from the general correspondence, describing how Emily had watched a recording of that broadcast almost every single day until she was too tired to ask for it anymore, wearing down the videotape enough that the family eventually had to have a second copy made. Diane wrote that in her daughter's final weeks, whenever Emily grew frightened in the way that children sometimes do in the middle of the night, someone in the room would simply say, "Remember, Mr. Rogers is with you," and her breathing would slow, and she would settle, sometimes within a minute, as though the words themselves carried something physical that reached her even through the fear. Fred Rogers kept a small photograph of Emily on his office desk in Pittsburgh for the rest of his life, tucked into the corner of the frame that held photographs of his own family, and in interviews afterward, whenever asked about the most meaningful moment of his career, spanning puppets and presidential testimonies and decades of daily broadcasts to millions of children, he gave the same brief answer every single time, never elaborating further no matter how the question was rephrased. It was never about being on television, he said. It was about keeping a promise to someone who needed it kept. That's all any of it was ever supposed to be about. If this story moved you, Think about the promises worth keeping in your own life, the quiet ones nobody else may ever know about, the ones you made without an audience and without any guarantee you'd ever get the chance to follow through. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. And before you go, hit that like button if this one got you. It really does help these stories find the people who need them most. Then drop a comment and tell me, has someone ever kept a promise to you that you didn't expect them to remember? Just tell us what happened, however small it seems. Let's remember them here together.